When the HOA sent out a letter demanding proof of a six-figure income or face eviction, they thought they could easily push out longtime residents like Jim Callahan. What they didn't realize was that they had just picked a fight with the wrong man. As Jim dug deeper, he uncovered fraud, secret deals, and illegal policies buried beneath layers of HOA corruption. But exposing the truth wouldn't be easy. Those in power were willing to do whatever it took to keep their scheme hidden. Can Jim bring them down before it's too late? Or will the HOA get away with their biggest scam yet? Subscribe to the channel and join the fight against HOA corruption. Comment below and share your experience with unfair HOA rules. Jim Callahan had lived in Willow Creek Estates for nearly 30 years, a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside of Denver, Colorado. It was the kind of place where people took pride in their homes, where kids rode bikes on the sidewalks, and retirees like Jim spent their afternoons tending to their gardens or sitting on their porches, watching the sunset over the distant Rocky Mountains. This was home. It had been ever since he and his late wife, Ellen, moved in all those years ago, dreaming of a peaceful life after his retirement from the U.S. Air Force. But today, standing in his kitchen, Jim stared at a letter in his hands that threatened to take all of that away. He adjusted his reading glasses, rereading the bold red warning stamped across the top of the page. Effective immediately. Any resident over the age of 65 must provide proof of an annual income exceeding $120,000 or relocate within 90 days. His gut twisted. This had to be a mistake. There was no way the HOA could just decide to evict people based on their income. He flipped through the rest of the letter, scanning for any legal justification. The document was signed by Lisa Hoa, the new president of the Willow Creek HOA, a woman he barely knew but had heard plenty about. Lisa had taken over just 6 months ago, and in that short time, she had turned the HOA into a dictatorship. She had doubled the HOA fees, fined people for the smallest infractions, and had already forced several longtime residents to move out. Some said she was working with real estate developers trying to modernize the community by bringing in wealthier homeowners. Now, it seemed, she was targeting retirees like him. Jim set the letter down on the counter, his fingers tightening into a fist. He wasn't rich, but he wasn't broke either. He had his military pension, Social Security, and some savings. Enough to live comfortably, but nowhere near the ridiculous income requirement Lisa was demanding. He had never missed a payment, never violated any rules, never caused any trouble. And yet, here he was, being told he had 3 months to either prove he was wealthy enough to live in his own home or get out. He exhaled sharply, trying to keep his temper in check. He had spent decades defending his country, but now, it seemed, he had to fight just to keep a roof over his head. That evening, he took a walk around the neighborhood, hoping to clear his mind. The crisp Colorado air filled his lungs, and for a moment, he let himself enjoy the view of the mountains in the distance. But as he passed the community clubhouse, he spotted Nancy and George Peterson, a retired couple who had lived in Willow Creek just as long as he had. They were standing in their driveway, staring at a letter identical to the one Jim had received. Nancy's hands shook as she clutched the paper, her voice barely above a whisper. "They can't do this," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "They already are," George replied bitterly. "We don't make anywhere near that kind of money. We were planning to live here for the rest of our lives." Jim stepped closer. "Looks like they're trying to force us out," he said grimly, "but they're not getting rid of me without a fight." Nancy looked up at him, hope flickering in her eyes. "Do you think we have a chance?" Jim nodded. "We're going to find out." That night, back home, Jim pulled out his laptop and got to work. He downloaded Willow Creek's HOA bylaws, comparing them with the new policies Lisa had implemented. Something didn't add up. He spent hours cross-referencing documents, sipping coffee as he went deeper into the HOA's records, and then, finally, he found it. The income requirement rule had never been voted on by the board or the residents. Lisa had added it herself, unilaterally without any approval. Jim's heart pounded. That wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. HOA rules had to be voted on before they could be enforced, and Lisa had bypassed the entire process. If this rule wasn't legally binding, then she had no right to evict anyone. He picked up his phone and dialed his daughter, Sarah, who worked as a real estate attorney in Phoenix, Arizona. She answered on the third ring. "Hey, Dad, everything okay?" "Not really," Jim admitted. "I need your help with something. My HOA is trying to force me out of my house, and they're doing it to other people, too." Sarah's tone sharpened. "Tell me everything." Jim walked her through the letter, the bylaws, and what he had discovered about the missing vote. Sarah listened carefully, occasionally muttering a curse under her breath. When he finished, she let out a slow exhale. "Dad, this is serious. What they're doing is illegal, but proving it won't be easy. We'll need documentation, meeting minutes, financial records, any communication from the HOA." Jim nodded. "Already on it. But there's one more thing. I have a feeling this isn't just about kicking out retirees. Something tells me Lisa's working with someone, probably a real estate developer who wants to flip these homes." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You might be right. I've seen cases like this before. Developers pressure HOAs to push out long-term residents so they can buy properties cheap and sell them at a massive profit. If that's what's happening, then this isn't just a housing issue, it's a fraud case." Jim's jaw tightened. "That's what I needed to hear." Sarah hesitated. "Dad, are you sure you want to take this on? These HOA cases can get messy. People have lost their homes fighting back." Jim's voice was steady. "I'm not going to sit back and let them take my home, and I sure as hell won't let them do it to my neighbors." Sarah sighed. "All right, I'll help you however I can. First, I'll draft a letter formally requesting access to HOA financial records. They're legally required to provide them to residents upon request. If they refuse, that gives us even more leverage." "Perfect," Jim said, "and I'll start talking to the other residents. We need to get everyone on board." Over the next few days, Jim met with dozens of his neighbors, many of whom had received the same eviction letter. Some were already packing, convinced they had no choice. Others were furious but didn't know how to fight back. Jim shared what he had learned, explaining that the rule was illegal and that Lisa was likely working with outside investors. "We have to stand together," he told them. "If we don't push back now, they'll keep doing this to people like us. They'll take our homes, sell them for a profit, and move on to the next neighborhood." Momentum started building. Residents who had been afraid began speaking up. They gathered every email, letter, and fee increase notice they had received from the HOA. Jim and Sarah compiled it all, painting a clear picture of a corrupt operation designed to displace seniors for financial gain. But Jim wasn't done yet. He wanted to hit Lisa where it hurt. So he called an old friend, Mike Hanley, a retired investigative journalist who now worked for Denver's local news station. "Mike," Jim said, "you ever cover HOA corruption?" "Not yet," Mike replied, "but I'd love to start." Jim woke up the next morning with a clear mission. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for every single neighbor who had received the same eviction letter. If Lisa Hoa thought she could get away with this, she was about to learn otherwise. He started his morning with a fresh pot of coffee and a long call with Sarah, who had already drafted a formal request demanding the HOA's financial records. By law, every HOA was required to maintain transparency with its members, and that included providing access to meeting minutes, budgets, and any contracts signed on behalf of the community. Jim printed out multiple copies of the request, stuffing them into envelopes. If Lisa refused to provide the documents, she'd be violating state law, and that would be the first crack in her carefully built facade. His next stop was George and Nancy Peterson's house. When he knocked on their door, George answered almost immediately, his expression tight with frustration. "Morning, Jim. Any news?" Jim handed him one of the envelopes. "We're filing formal requests for the HOA's financials. Sarah says they have no legal right to refuse. If they do, we can escalate it further." Nancy appeared behind George, a hopeful glint in her eyes. "So, we really have a case?" Jim nodded. "Not just a case, a chance to stop this before it gets worse." They weren't the only ones interested. By noon, Jim had gathered a group of nearly 20 residents at the community park, some of them furious, others desperate, but all of them ready to fight back. He explained what he and Sarah had found, that the new rule Lisa imposed wasn't just unfair, it was illegal, and that it reeked of something far worse than simple greed. More than half of the people there had noticed strange fees added to their HOA dues over the past 6 months. Others had received citations for ridiculous violations like having the wrong color flower pots or parking too close to the curb. A woman named Linda spoke up, her voice shaking with anger. "I've lived here for 15 years. Last month I got a notice saying my house needed exterior improvements, or I'd be fined. I had to spend thousands repainting my house, even though it was in perfect condition. Lisa even recommended a contractor. Turns out he's her cousin." Murmurs of agreement spread through the crowd. "Same thing happened to me," another resident said. "They fined me for a cracked driveway, even though half the houses on this street have worse driveways than mine." Jim's jaw clenched. This wasn't just about forcing retirees out. Lisa was running a full-scale operation to drain money from the residents. If she and her board were pocketing the funds, there was a clear trail to follow. "We need to document everything," he said. "Every notice, every fee, every conversation with the HOA. The more evidence we have, the stronger our case." Over the next few days, Jim and his growing group of supporters got to work. They took photos, compiled letters, and gathered statements from anyone who had been affected. Sarah worked on the legal side, preparing for the inevitable moment when Lisa would push back. But Jim wanted to take things a step further. He wasn't just going to fight this in court, he was going to expose Lisa's corruption to the public. That's where Mike Hanley came in. Jim met Mike at a diner off the main road, a place they used to visit back when Jim still worked in the Air Force. Mike, now a veteran journalist, still had that sharp, analytical look in his eyes. He sipped his coffee as Jim laid everything out for him, the illegal rule, the suspicious fees, the connections to contractors and real estate firms. Mike listened, nodding occasionally, but when Jim finally finished, the journalist leaned back and let out a low whistle. "This is bigger than just one HOA. If she's been doing this here, chances are it's happening in other neighborhoods too." Jim had already suspected as much. The kind of scheme Lisa was running didn't just pop up overnight. It was well thought out, carefully executed, and likely involved more than just one corrupt HOA president. "So, what do we do?" Jim asked. Mike grinned. "We expose her." By the time Jim left the diner, Mike had already started making calls. If everything went according to plan, Lisa's empire was about to crumble in front of her eyes. But Jim knew better than to assume victory too soon. Lisa had spent months solidifying her power, and she wasn't going to go down without a fight. That became clear the very next day when Jim found an envelope taped to his front door. Inside was a formal notice from the HOA. He was being fined $5,000 for disrupting community harmony and had 7 days to pay or face legal action. Jim shook his head, half amused, half infuriated. Lisa was panicking. This wasn't just about the money. This was an intimidation tactic, a last-ditch effort to scare him into submission. But she had made one fatal mistake. She had underestimated him. Instead of backing down, Jim marched straight to Lisa's office at the community clubhouse. When he walked in, she was sitting behind a sleek wooden desk, her usual cold smile in place. "Jim," she said smoothly, "I see you received your notice. I hope you understand that the HOA has rules in place for a reason." Jim placed the envelope on her desk, his expression unreadable. "And I hope you understand that I'm not paying a cent." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "Ignoring fines can lead to legal consequences, you know?" Jim smiled. "So can fraud." For the first time, Lisa's composure faltered. Jim reached into his bag and pulled out a neatly organized folder, sliding it across the desk. "That's a list of every illegal fine you've imposed, every suspicious financial transaction tied to your board, and every unethical contract you've signed in the past 6 months." He leaned in slightly. "And that's just the beginning." Lisa didn't touch the folder, but Jim could see the way her fingers curled slightly, her knuckles whitening. "You're making a lot of accusations, Jim." "I'm just getting started," he said calmly. "I have a news crew interested in your little operation. The Colorado Housing Authority is looking into your financials. And let's not forget, there's an emergency HOA meeting coming up where every single resident will hear exactly what you've been doing." For the first time, Lisa looked nervous. She was trapped, and she knew it. But instead of backing down, she forced a smile and stood up, straightening her blazer. "You're making a mistake," she said. "People like you think you can fight the system, but the system always wins." Jim met her gaze, unwavering. "You're right about one thing," he said. "The system does win, but you're not the system. You're just another scammer who got too greedy." Without another word, Jim turned and walked out of the office, leaving Lisa standing behind her desk, seething. Outside, George and Nancy were waiting for him, along with several other neighbors. "Well?" George asked. Jim smirked. "She's scared." Nancy let out a relieved breath. "Good, because we're not backing down." Jim looked around at the people who had once been afraid to speak up, now standing together, determined and ready. They had started this fight thinking they were up against an untouchable force. But now they knew the truth. Lisa wasn't invincible. She was just another fraud who had finally been caught, and in just a few days, the entire neighborhood would know it too. The night before the emergency HOA meeting, Jim Callahan sat in his home office, surrounded by stacks of documents, emails, and financial records. His daughter, Sarah, was on a video call, going over their final strategy. "We've got everything we need," she said. "Illegal fines, fraudulent contracts, financial discrepancies. If Lisa tries to deny any of it, we'll have the paper trail to prove otherwise." Jim nodded, but he knew Lisa wasn't the type to go down without a fight. She had spent months tightening her grip on Willow Creek Estates, manipulating the rules, intimidating residents, and pocketing thousands in illegal fees. Tomorrow, all of that would come crashing down. By sunrise, news of the meeting had spread throughout the neighborhood. Residents who had once been afraid to speak up were now eager to confront Lisa and her corrupt board. Some carried copies of their own eviction letters, others held binders filled with HOA violations and fees that had been forced upon them. As Jim walked to the community clubhouse, George and Nancy fell into step beside him. "You think she'll show up?" George asked. "Oh, she'll be there," Jim said. "She has no choice." The clubhouse was packed. Every chair was filled and dozens of people stood along the walls. At the front of the room, Lisa sat behind a long table, flanked by the HOA board members who had either supported her schemes or been too afraid to oppose her. She was dressed immaculately as always, her expression calm, but Jim could see the tension in her posture. She knew she was in trouble. Jim took a seat near the front, placing his folder of evidence on the table in front of him. The room buzzed with anticipation as Lisa cleared her throat and picked up her microphone. "Good morning, everyone. I understand there have been some concerns about recent policy changes, and I appreciate the opportunity to address them." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd. Jim smirked. Typical Lisa, pretending to be reasonable now that she was cornered. He let her talk, listing off generic justifications for the income requirement rule, claiming it was in the best interest of the community, that it was necessary to maintain high standards. But then she made her mistake. These rules were properly reviewed and approved by the HOA board, she said. That was the moment Jim had been waiting for. He stood, his voice clear and steady. "That's a lie." Lisa's smile faltered. "Excuse me?" Jim held up a thick stack of printed documents. I have copies of every HOA board meeting transcript from the last 12 months. Nowhere in any of these records is there a single mention of a vote to implement an income requirement. He walked toward the front of the room, turning to face the crowd. This rule was never approved by the board. Lisa wrote it herself and pushed it through without consent. That makes it not just unethical, but illegal. Gasps filled the room. Lisa shifted in her seat. Mr. Callahan, you don't have the authority to make such accusations. Jim raised an eyebrow. Oh, but I do. He turned to the side of the room where a woman in a gray suit had been silently observing. This is Ms. Karen Foster, a legal representative from the Colorado Housing Authority. I invited her here today because she's very interested in what's been going on in this community. Karen stepped forward, holding up a folder. After reviewing the evidence Mr. Callahan and other residents have provided, we have serious concerns about the financial management of this HOA. We have identified multiple violations of state housing laws, including fraudulent fines, unauthorized rule changes, and potential misappropriation of funds. Lisa's face drained of color. Before she could speak, Jim flipped to another page in his documents. Let's talk about the money, shall we? Over the past 6 months, Lisa has authorized over $250,000 in maintenance fees. Yet there have been no major renovations, no new amenities, and no explanation as to where this money has gone. He turned to the crowd. Where do you think it went? A man in the back shouted, Her pockets! A wave of angry agreement swept through the room. Lisa's voice wavered as she tried to regain control. This is outrageous. These are baseless accusations. Jim smirked. Then explain this. He held up a contract showing that a company called Greenstone Property Developers had made direct payments to Lisa just weeks before she announced the eviction policy. Greenstone specializes in flipping properties. Lisa wasn't protecting this community. She was trying to force people out so she could sell their homes to developers for a profit. The room erupted. Residents shouted over one another, demanding Lisa's resignation. Some yelled about the fines they had been forced to pay, others about the fear and stress she had inflicted upon them. Lisa stood abruptly. This meeting is over. She turned to leave, but Karen Foster blocked her path. I'm afraid it's not. The state will be conducting a full investigation into Willow Creek Estates, and I strongly suggest you cooperate. Lisa's hands clenched into fists. For the first time, she looked truly panicked. George stood up, his voice booming over the chaos. I propose a vote to remove Lisa Hoa from her position as HOA president, effective immediately. Nancy raised her hand. Seconded. One by one, hands shot into the air. A few hesitant board members looked at one another, then slowly raised their hands as well. The result was undeniable. By majority vote, Jim announced, Lisa Hoa is hereby removed from the HOA. Lisa let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. You think this is over? She hissed. You people don't know what you've done. Jim met her gaze, unflinching. No, Lisa. We know exactly what we've done. We took back our home. As Lisa was escorted out, the room erupted into cheers. People hugged, shook hands, and celebrated. Jim felt a hand on his shoulder. Nancy, tears in her eyes. Thank you, Jim, she whispered, for standing up for us. The days that followed brought swift action. The HOA board was restructured with new members who actually cared about the community. The fraudulent fines were overturned, and Lisa was soon facing legal consequences for her actions. Greenstone Property Developers backed out of their deals, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. Jim was asked to take over as HOA president, but he declined, nominating George instead. I've fought my battles, Jim said. It's time for someone else to lead. One afternoon, as he sat on his porch sipping his coffee, he received a handwritten note in his mailbox. It was from one of the elderly residents who had been at risk of losing her home. Because of you, I still have a place to call home. Thank you, Jim smiled, folding the letter carefully. He had spent decades defending his country, but this was a different kind of victory. A victory for justice, for fairness, for the people who had been forgotten. And as the sun set over Willow Creek Estates, Jim knew one thing for certain. His home and the community he loved were finally safe.